Welcome to the Gavel. Thanks for joining us. I am Terry Ikumi. Our focus this week is on the executive-legislative relationship, which seems to have defied expectations and gone from bad with the 8th Assembly to worse with the 9th National Assembly. The Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, PLAC, believes this could lead to impunity and has asked the President to rein in his appointees who fail to realize that they need to operate with a sense of responsibility and accountability within constitutional limits. Good thing the President has now responded and set up an Executive Legislative Party Consultative Committee. Well, here's a special report on the relationship between both arms of government and its impact on governance.
I'm here to allegiance.
At the inception of the 9th National Assembly, one of its goals was to maintain a symbiotic relationship with the executive arm of government in a manner that does not align with the fears of some Nigerians, which at the time was that it would be the rubber stamp of the executive, seeing how the leadership of the two chambers emerged. The expectations were that unlike the 8th Assembly, there would be an increased respect for the legislature. It's just over a year now, and it seems things have gone from bad to worse. Although there is a slight improvement with this assembly, as the security chiefs and the Inspector General of Police have honored invitations. Now, while there is no rancor between the presidency and the National Assembly leadership, like the previous assembly, the appointees of the president have displayed abysmal disregard for the National Assembly.
It means I have another alternative. You will meet me in court after this place.
From walking out on the lawmakers to heated exchanges.
This is very political.
Nobody is telling lies.
And I will show all the contracts awarded by the PDP government.
Allow me to go, I'll go. You cannot say something and disallow me the opportunity to respond.
Minister, please respond.
I'm responding, my friend. If you have me, I have you 10 times.
I won.
I'm a Lagos boy. You are just a small boy in Lagos.
And just like the previous assembly, refusing to honor invitations and summons.
This will be the last opportunity we will give to the central bank governor to appear before this committee. He is only the governor of the central bank and nothing else.
To invite a permanent secretary to come and appear and defend auditors' queries, and for such citizen to ignore the invitation of the parliament is an indication that such a person is incompetent.
But what could be responsible for this disregard of the National Assembly by the executive arm? And what's the way forward?
When the legislature is asking questions, the executive responds in a way that tries to frustrate a response to the questions that they should receive. So there has to be some sense in which the executive pulls back from lack of accountability. Because once it doesn't pull back, then what you have is impunity. And increasingly, you get the sense that the executive wants to do things without being questioned, without being accountable.
There are fears as well that this strained relationship could have a damaging effect on the country's democracy.
The responsibility of ensuring that we all pull back from impunity rests on the president to rein in and rein back those of its appointees who do not feel a responsibility to respect the constitutional provisions on accountability. When ministers are invited, when departments are invited, when heads of agencies are invited, and they do not respond to questions by the legislature, then it continues to weaken the legislative process.
For some, however, even the National Assembly shares in the blame, from how it carries out its oversight functions on the executive arm to its input in the budget, which has always raised questions. The legislature also needs to realize that it is accountable to the other two arms as well.
We are here to make sure such occurrences do not happen again.
Meanwhile, President Muhammadu Buhari has made some intervention in the matter with the setting up of an Executive Legislative Party Consultative Committee. This was made known by the President of the Senate after a meeting between President Muhammadu Buhari and the leadership of the National Assembly.
They must have that feeling that there is interdependence in their functions and roles. And until they realize there's that interdependence, there will always be problems, because the separation of powers is simply to ensure that none becomes a terror.
Well, let's get a clearer perspective into the legislative-executive relationship with Samson Itodo, who is the executive director of YAGA Africa.
It's important to underscore that when Montesquieu talked about and formulated this whole doctrine of separation of powers, that government powers should be shared between different arms of government. The executive, executes, the legislature makes the laws, and then you have the judiciary who interprets those laws. And for the legislature, their responsibility is to check and provide oversight on what happens in the executive, so what you call legislative oversight. And so the whole concept of separation of powers and checks and balances does not mean separation of government, because the legislature is also part of the state. And so it is still one administration with different component units, because those powers need to be shared. But because vesting overbearing powers on one particular arm of government, and like they say that absolute power corrupts absolutely, it is important to put a check on those powers. And so that's what the legislature is supposed to do. And so there has to be, that relationship, because what actually comes to play and what determines the success of any administration is its ability to balance power relations between these two different individuals. And that is why, the character of individuals that are voted into these offices are very, very important. And they must be people who are professional, who have competence, who have character, who can be in these offices, because they've got to manage those powers. And if you don't manage, those power distributions and those power relations, it's going to affect governance. And that's what we saw, in the life of the 8th Assembly. In the 8th Assembly, because of the acrimonious relationship between the executive and the legislature, you saw what happened. It cost the nation a lot. It cost us our electoral reforms. It cost jobs. It cost a lot. It impeded on development. And that's not supposed to be the case. But where there is a contest between the executive and the legislature, it should be on grounds of principles. And it shouldn't be based on individualistic agenda that people do have when they're actually in public office.
So let me quickly take you back, because the issue of electoral reforms is very important. You said that the last assembly, yes, because of the rancor between both arms, cost us the electoral reforms, as you rightly put it. So the question now is, with this assembly that you see, do you think that do you consider that could be improved upon in a manner that does not suggest that it will tilt in one direction?
Absolutely. And this committee is set up. Very commendable initiative, no doubt. The government needs to continuously, explore ways to cement its relationship with the legislature. In fact, the political elite, particularly the National Assembly and the President, must understand that accountability, if they care about good governance, if they care about their next level agenda and they care about moving Nigeria to the next level, then they should be interested in accountability. Because where you have accountability, where you have transparency, it boosts your chance of meeting those targets that you set for yourself. So they must approach this from that perspective, that where the legislature is enforcing its own constitutional powers to investigate on a particular matter, it is doing so in the interest of the vast majority of Nigerians that they represent.
Which is the ideal case?
Is
that what you see with the National Assembly?
No, to a large extent, you see some of that, but a lot of them have been driven by political consideration.
I think that there's an aspect that you mentioned that should be really emphasized on. When we talk about bills, those turn out to be laws and must be adhered to. Mm-hmm. When we talk about motions, you find that some of these motions are not obeyed by the executive. Yes, there are suggestions. You hear I urged the National Assembly urging the executive to do a particular thing, but in some cases that hasn't really been followed, to the extent that the legislative compliance committee of both chambers have had to be further mobilized to ensure compliance. What could be wrong in that regard?
Why would the executive not comply with motions? Or why do we expect the executive to comply with motions and resolutions of the National Assembly when we don't go back to the roots, of this problem? The truth is, until these institutions, both the executive and the National Assembly, understand their role and have respect for each other, you will continue to have situations where motions and resolutions of the National Assembly are not respected. Because you have an executive that has overbearing powers. And it's about our Constitution. You know, the Constitution vests so much powers in the executive, right? And so we need, in this whole constitutional review process, to look at how do you limit the powers of the executive and strengthen also that of the other arms of government. And they said yes, it's advisory. It's mere resolution of the legislature, and the executive cannot comply with it. But and that's where this cooperation between these institutions are very, very important. But cooperation does not mean compromise. I think it's very, very important to emphasize that. Cooperation does not mean you're a rubber stamp, legislature. You still have to hold the executive to account, and you also have to subject yourselves to scrutiny by the people, because you're also representatives of the people. And one way or the other, this tripartite relationship also vests some sort of responsibilities of transparency and accountability to other arms of government.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that relationship, because one would have expected that with the way this leadership emerged, having gained the support of the leadership of the party and the president, you'd expect a better working relationship. Now, there is no rancor between the leadership of both chambers of the National Assembly and the executive. However, the appointees of the government who are somehow, or to an extent, party loyalists, have still failed to maintain a good relationship. You would have expected an improved relationship compared to what we had in the previous assembly, but it doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it's gone from bad to worse. What could be responsible, since it's the same party?
Terry, let me also put this out, that the fact that you have a frosty relationship between the executive and the legislature, provided that contestation is on grounds of principles. It's on grounds of rule of law and constitutionalism. It is good for our democracy. We need to emphasize that. So when the legislature raises questions and calls the executive to account, it is performing its responsibility. And that is why when Montesquieu, who propounded that whole concept of separation of powers, talked about, checks and balances. So there is nothing wrong. Will it cost the nation, governance? Sometimes it does. That is why you need statesmen, people who have the interest of the people at heart in public office. So when you have this situation, they look at the overall interest of the people and, adopt those or seek to achieve that particular objective. But what you see today between the executive and the legislature, to a large extent, if you look at the critical issues, if you look at the NDDC, for instance, right, that committee was headed by a legislator from the ruling APC. Does that mean that as an individual, as a member of that committee, is a challenge on the executive? I think these committees are performing their functions. That is what Section 88 asks them to do. And the Nigerian public wouldn't have known, because what the National Assembly is doing is the Constitution gives them this responsibility. They are performing their responsibility. So I don't think it's an attack or an embarrassment on the executive. No, it is their job, and they are performing.
No, that's beyond.
Because there are some people who think that suggests that there is some rancor within the ruling party.
No, it's more about...
It may be, but it is their function.
No, it's more about the reaction of the executive, the appointees of the president to the National Assembly, who you just rightly pointed out are doing their legislative function. You've seen that kind of reactions. You've seen that in different cases, from the Committee on Treaties and Protocols to the Committee on Works. You've seen that kind of reactions from the executive.
Why do you think the appointees of the president are emboldened?
I think that's what's important to find out.
I think, and this is my considered opinion, that they are emboldened by also the body language of the president. Because the president, from 2015, has actually shown disregard for the institution of the legislature. I think there are fundamental principles that we need to acknowledge. That one, accountability and transparency are critical to governance. And the National Assembly itself must subject itself to accountability as well as transparency.
Before you can get the
before
respect,
you can even
yes.
get the respect. And how would you do that? The quality of the bills that you sponsor. Are those bills pro-people bills? You have a bill on hate speech. You have bills like social media bills. You have, bills that seem to limit and shrink the civic space. You have bills that are anti-people. When you have bills that are anti-people, the people will rise against you.
Is a bill that is anti-people entirely a bad bill?
No, the bill that is anti-people is actually a bad bill.
For
because
example,
the
you
National
mentioned-
Assembly exists. It exists for the people.
But you do understand that the average human is not open to certain kind of changes. Doesn't mean that change is bad.
No, I agree with you. So let's look, for instance, let's look at the social media bill. The social media bill, not anti-people. Let's look at the recently passed Karma bill under Part F that deals with religious institutions and incorporated trustees. And until date, people are wondering. You also look at the new one now, which is the water resources bill. You see, it is important for us to acknowledge that, yes, whilst you have majority of your population who are disengaged, and I'd say this is also an assumption because we abuse the sensibilities of Nigerians and think Nigerians don't know what they want. No, a lot of Nigerians know what they want. It's just that the opportunities for them to ventilate their views does not exist, or it's limited. Secondly, the fact that they are unable to articulate their views, which is what legislators ought to do. Because as legislators in the National Assembly, when they rise to speak for and on behalf of their people, it is believed that they have consulted with the people, they know their challenges, and so they are articulating those views in the National Assembly. So some of these bills are anti-people. Any bill that seeks to shrink the civic space is anti-people, is anti-democratic, and a National Assembly that prides itself as a participatory hub of democracy shouldn't be the one, passing such legislation. So in my view, they are actually anti-people bill.
There was an instance where the PDP minority caucus of the House, or the PDP caucus of the House of Representatives, didn't want, I think that also extended to the Senate, did not want to discuss the budget when it was presented, the 2020 budget. The reason being that the details of the budget were not presented to them as promised by the president. He said that the Minister of Finance would make those details available to the National Assembly, but those details were not presented, and the bill was about to be debated for second reading. And you found a situation where the leadership of the National Assembly didn't think that that was any meaningful.
You see, the greatest threat, and I dare say that when you talk about cordial relationship between the executive and the legislature, and this committee set up by the president, a fantastic committee, it would, spur, in our estimation, more and improved, legislation and governance of the country, is I hope that will not be traded, or you will not trade due diligence. You will not trade accountability and transparency just because of this sort of cordial relationship with the executive. And that's very disturbing. And I've said this, if you look at the 2020 appropriation bill that was passed and how it was passed, let's look at even MTEF, how that whole process was. It's good, yes, we want to adjust the budget calendar. Fantastic, pass it within record time. But do we ensure due diligence? Have the National Assembly and members been availed with enough information to be able to scrutinize, the budget?
Let's go to the committee set up by the president now. It sounds like it has a party connotation. It's the legislative, executive, party consultative committee, suggesting an APC kind of setting. What do you expect to come out of something like this? Is the rancor between the executive and the legislative, executive and legislature, a matter of party?
Now, like I said earlier, this tripartite committee is a welcome development. Will it foster good working relationship between the executive and the legislature and the political party? To a large extent, it would. and Nigerians and those who believe in governance should support, this action taken by the executive. However, it is worth underscoring that this committee itself should ensure, and particularly the National Assembly, because the National Assembly owes Nigerians a lot of responsibility. It is our participatory hub. When Nigerians have issues, that's where they go to, because they represent us. And so they must not trade the priorities of Nigerians and the issues of Nigerians for either party decisions or party loyalty. No, your loyalty first is to the people that voted you into office. So we need to underscore that. The second is, yes, whilst there may be an alignment between the agenda of the executive and the party with that of the legislature, it's important. Separation of government, separation of powers is not separation of government. It's still one government and one administration. And so those priority areas that the president has, highlighted, call it social cohesion, poverty, critical infrastructure. Yes, the National Assembly should support that, but provide oversight. In fact, that relationship gives you an opportunity to provide quality legislative oversight because you have access, to information. And thirdly, it's about openness. Nigerians would want to know what transpires in this committee with respect to, one, the electoral reform bill, which is a priority issue. The president declined assent to the electoral reform bill 4 times. We hope that by this committee, we will not be seeing declines of assent for legislations that are passed by the National Assembly, especially priority legislations like the electoral reform bill, provided the National Assembly itself ensures due diligence and public participation.
You just mentioned a few bills that need to be amended, and we hear from some quarters that the social media bill and the hate speech bill will still be passed by the National Assembly despite the public outcry. What will this do to the country? And do you see the president assenting to those bills?
I think that everything is possible within the Nigerian political context. I would not bet that certain bills will not be passed because you can see the level of the rate at which the civic space is shrinking. And you see the rate of human rights abuses. So I won't be shocked and I won't be surprised. I think that it will be shameful and embarrassing if the Senate considers this bill and this legislation, particularly the social media bill and the hate speech bill, because I was at the public hearing and majority of Nigerians have said no to those bills. If the Senate proceeds to consider the bill, they're telling Nigerians one thing, that they are not in the Senate, or as a Senate do not represent the people. They only represent themselves and the politicians who are working in cohort with themselves to sponsor and pass that legislation. Nigerians are looking for a time when, one, things about human rights, the Section 4 of our Constitution, will be protected. Nigerians are looking for economic stimulus legislations that will lift people out of poverty, that will give people food on their table, that will create jobs. Just look at our unemployment rate in the country today. It's about 27%. And we're just folding our hands. And people in Edo and Ondo, the political elites to be specific, are instrumentalizing and using violence because they want to perpetuate themselves in office. So these are issues. Nigerians want an electoral reform legislation that protects the sanctity of the votes ahead of the 2023 elections. These are priority legislations as opposed to the hate speech bill and the social media bill. I don't think the National Assembly, this 9th National Assembly, should proceed with considering this bill.
Mr. Samson Itodo, thank you so much.
Thanks, always a delight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's the Gavel this week. The National Assembly resumes in under 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. I'm Terry Ikumi. Goodbye.